Imagine this with a chilling, almost surgical clarity. From one day to the next, Fortune, that fickle, unpredictable mistress, tilts her head toward you and smiles without restraint. Perhaps a tiny investment you barely remembered placing suddenly erupts beyond all logic. A side business you once treated as a playful experiment begins to generate money as if minting its own currency. Or a distant relative you hardly knew leaves behind an inheritance that falls into your hands with no effort, no warning, no explanation. It feels divine, doesn't it? A blessing fallen straight from the sky, a golden rope descending into your ordinary life. But Machiavelli, that ruthless anatomist of human ambition, issued a warning that transcends centuries. "Fortune," he wrote, "is a woman capricious, radiant, intoxicating, and she favors the bold, but she abandons the unprepared." What feels like an undeserved miracle can, in a single violent moment, become a social execution order. Why? Because sudden wealth, like sudden power, does not transform who you are. It exposes who you already were. It amplifies your flaws, magnifies your secret habits, and tears open illusions you had carefully dressed as virtues. You think you are gaining unconditional freedom, but in reality, you are attracting a gravitational pull. People you once considered distant begin orbiting around you, some hungry, others desperate, many pretending to care but secretly competing for a sliver of your newly expanded world. And this scenario, no matter how distant it feels, is not rare. The probability that someone listening to these words will experience a version of it is higher than you think. Yet here lies the dark twist. The trap Machiavelli witnessed in the Italian courts. Those who stumble into wealth rarely manage to keep it. If you are ready to master the cold logic of fortune, if you want to shield your empire from the shadows even as you build it, then lean in. The true defense of wealth does not begin with celebration, it begins with silence. Relentless studies on lottery winners and instant millionaires reveal a law so strange, so consistently repeated that it borders on the supernatural. The faster the rise, the more catastrophic the fall. More than half end up divorced, addicted, or bankrupt within a few years. They lose friends, family, reputation long before the money evaporates. The root cause: they confuse wealth with wisdom. They forget Machiavelli's central truth. The art of maintaining power is infinitely harder than the act of acquiring it. He observed it in princes who inherited kingdoms they never built. He who becomes a prince through fortune, Machiavelli wrote, will hold his power only as long as fortune allows. Money obeys the same law. If you did not cultivate the discipline that creates wealth, the fortune you receive will erode faster than you can spend it. So before you celebrate, you must absorb a brutal truth. Your greatest advantage is silence. The modern world trains you to broadcast your victories, post them, shout them, parade them as proof of your worth. But those who trumpet their success also amplify their vulnerability. The wise move differently. They adopt what we now call stealth wealth, the art of possessing everything while appearing to possess nothing. Their neighbors believe they live modestly, while in reality their influence reaches far beyond what eyes can measure. Let's examine history. Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli's archetype of cunning, charm, and cold precision, built his rising empire through calculated brilliance. Yet even he learned that visibility breeds enemies. His fortune attracted treachery more quickly than admiration. Centuries later, Jack Whittaker won $315 million overnight. He became a national celebrity, showering strangers with generosity, funding churches, buying houses for friends. For a brief moment, the public adored him. Then the noise faded, and so did his world. His marriage collapsed, his friends disappeared, and his granddaughter spiraled into addiction and tragedy. Years later, he confessed that the money had been a curse. "I wish I had torn that ticket," he said. A statement ripped straight from the pages of The Prince. The first rule of sudden wealth is the first rule of surviving power. Hide it. Protect your strength until it becomes unshakable. We live in an era obsessed with exposure, but anonymity has become the new armor. You may believe you can handle attention, filter requests, or control the narrative. Machiavelli would laugh softly and remind you, men are fickle, envious, and driven by perception, not reason. When they sense your advantage, they test your limits. Even those closest to you will subconsciously compare their lives to yours, and comparison breeds resentment faster than greed. So how do you protect yourself in a world that worships exposure? How do you move boldly toward greater power while remaining unseen? The answer is not only silence, it is structure. Privacy is not just about who you tell. It is about how you build. Thus arises the second law of sudden fortune, the Machiavellian art of disguise. You cannot simply be wealthy. You must learn to move like the wealthy, invisible, untouchable, and protected behind legal walls that turn your money into an impenetrable fortress. A prince, Machiavelli said, must build fortresses not of stone, but of design. For you, that fortress is privacy disguised as normality. Even if you tell no one of your newfound fortune, people will sense the shift. They smell wealth the way wolves smell blood. Subtle changes, small upgrades, shifts in posture, new habits betray your transformation. The world teaches you to display success. Machiavelli teaches you to disguise it. The first person you confide in should not be a friend or relative, it should be a lawyer. the modern equivalent of an advisor who speaks the ancient language of trusts, foundations, and fiscal shields. Because true wealth is never owned directly, it is layered, structured, hidden behind proxies. Machiavelli told rulers to govern through intermediaries so that the true source of power remained concealed. Today, that means a trust that hides your name, a holding company that shields your assets, and professionals who manage your affairs while your public life appears unchanged. Discretion is not paranoia, discretion is power. Jack Whittaker screamed his fortune and died hollow. The Rothschilds built theirs and remained invisible for centuries, even while financing wars and kings. Their families appeared modest, calm, almost ordinary. They let their influence speak louder than their lifestyle. That is stealth wealth, the aristocracy of silence. What nobody tells you as you move through life is that most people are not actually living, they're reperforming. They wake up each morning, slip into their designated roles, rehearse the same lines, and walk through days scripted not by their own desires but by invisible expectations they never questioned. And somewhere in that silent performance, they forget they ever had a voice beneath the noise. They forget they once carried dreams that weren't shaped by fear or comparison. They forget they once belonged to themselves. Human beings break quietly, not dramatically, not with thunder, not in ways the world immediately notices. They fracture in small, nearly invisible moments, when they say yes while their soul whispers no, when they apologize for existing, when they shrink to make others more comfortable, when they betray themselves so subtly that they don't realize the wound until it's become part of them. And the world rarely asks, "Are you okay?" Instead, it applauds the performance, applauds the mask, applauds the survival. But survival isn't the same as living. Sometimes you don't collapse because you're weak. You collapse because you've been strong for far too long. You collapse because you've carried storms in silence that no one else has had to weather. You collapse because you've spent years pretending the weight on your chest was simply normal, as if suffocating quietly were part of the human condition. And the tragedy is that you start to believe it. One of the greatest illusions of modern existence is the belief that fatigue, numbness, and emotional exhaustion are signs of failure. In truth, they're signs of humanity. They are the body's natural response to a world that constantly demands more than it gives. A world where rest is considered laziness and vulnerability is viewed as weakness. But the truth is simple. No one can outrun emptiness forever. No one can silence their inner voice without consequence. Eventually, the soul demands to be heard. Every person carries a version of themselves that the world never sees. A version that speaks softly, asking you to slow down, to breathe, to return to the things that make you feel alive. But most people silence that voice because it doesn't fit the performance. That voice is too honest, too raw, too inconvenient. And so it gets buried under routine, under responsibility, under fear of disappointing others. Yet every buried truth eventually becomes a ghost that follows you, whispering reminders of everything you abandoned. There's a moment, subtle, quiet, but unmistakable, when you realize that the life you're living no longer belongs to you. Maybe it hits you in the middle of the night when the silence is finally louder than the noise. Maybe it hits you on a random afternoon when you catch your own reflection and don't recognize the eyes staring back. Maybe it hits you after a heartbreak, a loss, or a disappointment that shakes everything you thought you understood. In that moment, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. You've been drifting through a story you never wrote. But awakening is not a graceful process. It is messy, uncomfortable, and often painful. It requires dismantling identities built over years, questioning beliefs you once held sacred, and confronting parts of yourself you spent a lifetime avoiding. Awakening tears you open only to rebuild you differently. It forces you to meet the version of yourself that has always been waiting behind the noise. You begin to see how much of your life was shaped by fear, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being alone, the fear of disappointing people who were never meant to define your worth. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The world becomes clearer, sharper, more honest. You start noticing the lies you told yourself just to survive. You start noticing the ways you protected everyone except yourself. You start noticing the parts of your soul that have been starving. The journey inward is the most dangerous journey of all, because it reveals truths that can no longer be ignored. It reveals wounds you pretended didn't exist. It reveals desires you buried because they didn't fit the life you were told to want. It reveals the difference between who you are and who you learned to be. And once that difference becomes clear, you stand at a crossroads. Return to the comfort of the familiar, or step into the unknown and become who you were always meant to be. Most people choose the familiar not because it's fulfilling, but because it's predictable. The unknown terrifies them. Freedom terrifies them. Authenticity terrifies them. To live truthfully is to risk being misunderstood, judged, rejected, and humans crave belonging so deeply that they often sacrifice themselves for it. But belonging that requires self-betrayal is not belonging. It is captivity disguised as connection. Slowly, you begin to realize that your pain wasn't a punishment, it was a compass. Every wound carried a message. Every disappointment pointed towards something you refused to face. Every heartbreak peeled away illusions you were afraid to let go of. Pain wasn't trying to break you. It was trying to wake you. It was trying to return you to yourself. And the more you listen, the more you see that the things you feared the most were never your enemies. Loneliness, instead of being a void, becomes a mirror. Silence, instead of being empty, becomes a teacher. Stillness, instead of being unsettling, becomes a sanctuary. In the absence of noise, you finally hear your own voice, fragile at first, but undeniably yours. You start to notice the difference between peace and distraction. You start to understand why the world keeps people busy, because silence reveals truths that convenience hides. You start to see how much of modern life is built to keep people numbscrolling endlessly, chasing validation, drowning in stimulation that never satisfies. But once you taste real clarity, artificial noise loses its sweetness. Little by little, you return to yourself. Not all at once. Healing is not linear, it's a spiral. You revisit lessons, revisit wounds, revisit versions of yourself you thought you had outgrown. But each time you return stronger, wiser, more aware. Each time you rebuild with better materials, honesty, boundaries, self, and eventually, almost unexpectedly, you reach a point where you no longer fear losing people, you fear losing yourself. You no longer crave acceptance, you crave authenticity. You no longer shrink to fit into spaces. You search for spaces that were built for someone like you. You stop pretending. You stop performing. You stop apologizing for being who you are. What once felt like the end becomes the beginning. What once felt like destruction becomes creation. What once felt like emptiness becomes possibility. Because when you finally return to yourself, you discover something extraordinary. The life you were searching for was always waiting beneath the ruins. You just needed the courage to uncover it. There comes a time in every person's inner unfolding when the world they once depended on begins to feel unfamiliar. The routines that once offered comfort feel hollow. The expectations they once chased no longer spark motivation. The masks they once wore so easily begin to feel unbearably heavy. This shift doesn't happen loudly, it happens quietly, like a slow unraveling of the old self, a silent loosening of the chains that once felt permanent. You don't realize it at first, but you're shedding versions of yourself that were built on survival, not truth. You begin noticing how many of your choices were shaped not by desire but by fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being seen, fear of being wrong, fear of standing alone. Fear disguised as responsibility. Fear disguised as logic. Fear disguised as the voice of everyone who ever told you that your dreams were unrealistic. And once you recognize fear's fingerprints on your life, you can't keep living as if you don't see them. You start questioning everything you once accepted without hesitation. Why did I abandon that passion? Why did I silence that instinct? Why did I allow myself to become someone I barely recognize? The questions are uncomfortable, even frightening, but they carry a strange sense of relief because at last, you're telling yourself the truth. Truth is disruptive. It doesn't come to politely knock on your door. It comes to dismantle the walls you built to protect yourself. It forces you to confront the memories you avoided, the dreams you buried, the wounds you pretended had healed. Truth is the fire that burns away illusion, leaving only what was always real, and facing it is the beginning of liberation. There's a strange paradox in healing. The more you return to yourself, the more foreign the world around you feels. Conversations that once entertained you now feel repetitive. Spaces that once felt comfortable now feel too small. People you once tried desperately to impress no longer hold power over you. You start craving something deeper connection, deeper meaning, deeper truth. Superficiality begins to drain you instead of distract you. You realize that much of what people call growth is actually avoidance. They stay busy to avoid stillness. They stay loud to avoid silence. They stay surrounded to avoid themselves. But real growth happens in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when the performance stops and the inner voice becomes impossible to ignore. Growth is not a beautified journey, it is a dismantling. A stripping away of the false layers, a return to origins. Sometimes, the greatest transformation happens not when you gain something new, but when you finally let go of something old, a belief, a habit, a version of yourself that no longer fits. People assume letting go is an act of weakness, but it is the bravest act of self-respect. You release not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring about yourself. And it is in this space between who you were and who you re-becoming that life feels most uncertain. This in-between stage is uncomfortable. You're no longer the person you used to be, but not yet the one you're becoming. You feel lost, but in truth you're not lost at all, you're transitioning. Growth rarely feels like progress, it feels like confusion. But confusion is a sign that the old framework is breaking, making space for clarity. In the stillness of this transition, you begin to feel things you once numbed. Emotions you avoided resurface with intensity. Grief for the time you lost pretending to be someone you weren't. Sadness for the dreams you abandoned. Anger for the ways you neglected yourself. But these emotions aren't enemies, they are the compass, pointing toward your healing. You must feel them to free them, and slowly, something shifts. The heaviness begins to lift, the fog begins to clear, the world begins to open in new ways. You start experiencing life with an honesty you've never known. You notice beauty in places you once ignored. The warmth of sunlight on your skin, the rhythm of your breath, the rare quiet moments when your thoughts finally soften. You begin valuing peace over stimulation. You begin valuing sincerity over approval. You also begin realizing that not everyone can come with you into this new chapter. Some people are tied to your old identity. Some only understand the version of you that hid, that tolerated, that bent, that accepted less than what you deserved. When you change, your relationships must either transform or end. It's not cruelty, it's alignment. Love that requires you to shrink is not love. It is longing dressed as attachment. What surprises you most is that becoming yourself requires losing things you once prayed to keep. But as painful as it is, something deeper whispers, this loss is necessary. Because you cannot step into your truth while clinging to what kept you small. Every ending creates space. Every goodbye creates room for something truer. Life pries your fingers open only when it knows you are holding on to something that is no longer yours. And then, there is the moment rare, unmistakable, when you feel yourself returning. Not to who you were, but to who you were always meant to be. You speak differently, you move differently, you make decisions from alignment, not fear. Your boundaries strengthen not out of anger, but out of clarity. You begin walking with a sense of inner solidity that no longer depends on external validation. You realize that the real journey was never about becoming someone new, but about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. You uncover qualities that were always there: courage disguised as sensitivity, strength disguised as vulnerability, purpose disguised as pain. You start seeing yourself with compassion instead of criticism. And in this awakening, you understand something profound. The most important relationship you will ever have is the one you build with yourself. Everything else is a reflection of that. Your boundaries reflect your self-respect. Your choices reflect your values. Your relationships reflect your inner truth. When you align with yourself, life aligns with you. Authenticity is not a destination, it is a daily practice. 1,000 small decisions to choose truth over comfort. 1,000 moments where you return to yourself even when the world pulls you away. 1,000 reminders that your worth is inherent, not earned. And somewhere in this relentless, messy, breathtaking journey, you realize the most liberating truth of all. You were never broken, you were becoming. There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, almost imperceptible, when you realize that everything you once believed about yourself was too small, not wrong, not foolish, just limited. You are larger than the fears that shaped you, deeper than the wounds that silenced you, and far more resilient than the moments that tried to break you. This realization doesn't arrive like lightning. It dawns slowly, like the first light before sunrise, illuminating pieces of you that you forgot existed. You begin seeing your past differently. The events that once felt like punishment now resemble instruction. The people who hurt you become unintentional teachers. The years you thought were wasted become seasons of preparation. You begin understanding that nothing was random, not the heartbreaks, not the lost opportunities, not the detours that felt like failures. Life wasn't working against you. It was carving you into someone capable of carrying a truth you couldn't hold before. And the truth is this: you were never meant to live a life built on fear, compliance, or the expectations of others. You were meant to live boldly, honestly, unapologetically. You were meant to expand, not shrink, to express, not suppress, to rise, not merely survive. But you cannot rise while carrying the weight of an identity that no longer fits. The old self must fall away, not as punishment, but as evolution. There is an old saying that the same walls that protect you also confine you. And when you finally gather the courage to step beyond those walls, you discover that freedom is far more disorienting than captivity. Freedom requires responsibility. Freedom requires awareness. Freedom requires you to stand face to face with the vastness of your own potential. And potential can be terrifying. It calls you, challenges you, dares you. It whispers, there is more, go find it. The journey outward from your old life mirrors the journey inward to your true self. Both require letting go of who you thought you needed to be, letting go of who you were told to become, letting go of the voices that echo with doubt or judgment. But the most difficult letting go is the letting go of the version of yourself that survived. That version was strong, stronger than you ever gave it credit for. It carried you through storms, held you together when everything was falling apart, endured when you felt like collapsing. But survival is not the same as fulfillment, and you cannot build a new life on a foundation made only of endurance. In the stillness that comes after releasing the old, something remarkable happens. You start feeling a soft inner call, gentle, persistent, unmistakable. It invites you to rebuild your life from authenticity rather than fear, to choose what aligns rather than what pleases, to follow what ignites you rather than what impresses others. This call is the beginning of a new kind of existence, not one built on avoidance or protection, but one built on intention. You notice the shift in small ways at first. You no longer tolerate conversations that drain you. You stop apologizing for boundaries. You walk away from people who confuse your kindness with weakness. You speak more slowly because you're no longer rushing to fill silence. You listen more deeply because you finally understand that every person carries a universe of their own. And you start showing up for yourself not as an obligation, but as an act of devotion. You begin trusting your inner compass, that quiet, ancient intelligence that always knew the way long before fear clouded your vision. You realize that intuition isn't mystically its memory. It's the remembrance of who you were before the world taught you to doubt. It's the voice of your truest self, the self beneath the noise, the self that never left. And as you draw closer to that self, a different kind of strength emerges, not the brittle strength you used to wear like armor, but a fluid, grounded strength that bends without breaking, a strength rooted in clarity, not defense, a strength that doesn't shout to be heard because it knows its own power. In this new chapter, vulnerability becomes your ally instead of your enemy. You stop seeing it as exposure and start seeing it as connection. You begin opening up not carelessly, but consciously. You reveal your fears, your doubts, your hopes, your wounds, not to be validated but to be known, to be human, and in doing so, you create a life built on presence rather than performance. For the first time, you allow yourself to imagine a future not defined by survival, a future where peace is normal, not rare, where love is mutual, not conditional, where your worth is inherent, not negotiated. You begin realizing that the life you once envied in others was not about their circumstances, it was about their alignment. People who live authentically don't have perfect lives. They simply refuse to abandon themselves. And then, without fanfare, you reach a point where you no longer resent your past. You honor it. You understand that the person you once were wasn't weak. They were doing the best they could with what they had. They protected you until you were strong enough to protect yourself. They carried you until you were ready to walk on your own. They hid your truth until you were finally ready to live it. Gratitude replaces shame. Compassion replaces regret. Integration replaces fragmentation. Healing stops being a destination and becomes a rhythm. Some days you rise effortlessly. Other days you sink into old fears. But even in your sinking, you are different. You don't panic. You don't collapse. You recognize the pattern. You ride the wave instead of resisting it. You understand that darkness is not a step backward. It is simply another room in the house of your becoming. And in this understanding, you unlock one of the deepest truths of existence. Wholeness is not the absence of brokenness. It is the acceptance of every part of you, even the parts you once tried to hide. Wholeness is making peace with your contradictions, embracing the shadows that shaped your strength, and acknowledging the scars that proved your resilience. Wholeness is living without abandoning yourself. Eventually, you stand on the threshold of a new life quietly, steadily, with a sense of inner certainty that cannot be shaken. You don't need dramatic epiphanies or external validation. You don't need applause or permission. You simply know. You know who you are. You know what you value. You know what your soul refuses to tolerate. And you know that whatever comes next, you will meet it without betraying yourself. This is what freedom feels like. Not rebellion, not chaos, but clarity. A calm, unshakable clarity that comes from living in alignment with your truth. A clarity that makes you unmovable in a world built on distraction. A clarity that allows you to love deeply without losing yourself, to dream boldly without fear, to walk alone without loneliness. And maybe this is the final lesson the one life was preparing you for all along. You were never meant to fit into the world, you were meant to reshape the world by being fully yourself. When you finally embody that truth, everything changes. Your relationships deepen, your choices sharpen. Your purpose reveals itself not as something you chase, but as something you become. And the life you once thought was impossible suddenly feels inevitable. Because becoming yourself isn't the end of the journey, it is the beginning of everything.